part of Understanding Islam, Unpacking the Shahada. I'm going to be explaining the relationship between Muhammad and the Quran and how they work together, impacting Islam. As it happens, many of the core characteristics of the practice of Islam are not actually mandated in the Quran. So very important things about Islam that people do every day that are considered part of the central practice are not reflected or explained or defined clearly in the Quran. One example is the 5 pillars. It's very well known that there are 5 pillars of Muslim practice. And these are the confession of faith, saying the Shahada, the daily prayers 5 times a day. They're really worship, acts of worship, of ritual worship. Paying zakat, this is sometimes called alms. They can be used to help the poor, but they can also be used for jihad. They can be used for a variety of religious purposes. A pilgrimage to Mecca, if you're able to achieve it, and fasting during Ramadan. I think just about every Muslim knows that these are part of Islamic practice, but there is no list of them in the Quran. There's no place in the Quran where these are defined as the things that Muslims should do. This list exists because one day someone asked Muhammad and said, "Tell me about faith." And he said, these are the 5 things. So it comes out of the hadith, out of the life of Muhammad, that these 5 practices are defined. Also, the 7, sometimes 6 basic beliefs of Islam. These will be found in introductory explanations of Islam. If you get a little booklet from a mosque explaining Islam, they might list these 6 or 7 basic beliefs. And these are belief in Allah, belief in angels, belief in the books, that is that Muhammad and previous prophets received books, the messengers, the prophets themselves, belief in the last day, judgment day, or sometimes what's called the divine decree or predestination, and belief in the resurrection. Now again, this list or lists like this are not found in the Quran. They're found in the life of Muhammad. Also, the description of the ritual for the daily prayers. You'll be aware that Muslims 5 times a day go through a series of bodily movements and they say certain words in Arabic that are part of the daily prayers, and every small child is taught how to pray. The instructions for those prayers are not in the Quran. If you didn't have the hadith, the life of Muhammad, Muslims wouldn't know how to do their daily prayers. So a huge amount of the core practice of Islam is not actually found in the Quran. Many aspects of Islamic laws are found in the hadith. In fact, sometimes the hadith abrogates or takes authority over the Quran. It cancels teachings found in the Quran. So the life of Muhammad is incredibly important in Islam. You can access the hadiths online. There are collections translated into English. It was a time 50, 60 years ago when very few people would be able to read these materials, but now they are available. It's a lot of material. The Sahih al-Bukhari is books, this many books, and then Muslim is so many, and there's 6 collections, and so it's quite a lot of material altogether. There's also the sirah, the biographies. The hadiths are generally organised for legal purposes, so they'll have all the things collected under one topic, all the things to do with warfare under one book or sub-book. But you really need to know the order, the sequence in Muhammad's life as well. That's very important for understanding Islamic law. And the materials of Muhammad's life are organised in chronological sequence in books that are called sirah. And there's a photograph there of the earliest sirah, the biography, the life of Muhammad. It's by Ibn Ishaq, and it's been translated in the 50s and is readily available. It's a very interesting and important book to read. Anyone who wants to be seriously engaged with Islam should have read that and be familiar with what's in it. The sirah, the biographies, are not as authoritative as the hadith in terms of the authenticity of the materials. And the earliest source, this one that's pictured there, is written about 150 years after the migration to Medina, and then was edited around 200 years after the migration. So again, not as early a source as the Gospels. Remember, the hadiths were systematized 200 to 300 years after Muhammad. Contrast that with the Gospels, which were all written down within a lifetime. It'd be like writing the life of the Beatles today. Whereas when you think about the sirah, the biographies or the hadith, collecting those were done after a 200-year time period. So it'd be like writing about events that took place in Canada in 1800. So the Christian materials of the life of Jesus are written down with a much shorter time frame than the Islamic materials were sorted and collected and agreed upon. That's because the Muslims were so busy conquering the world for the first 200 years, they didn't quite get their materials organized until later. Now, Muhammad's life, as I said, is obligatory for Muslims to follow, and he is revered incredibly highly. Sometimes Muslims will say, you know, it's wrong to insult Muhammad, but it's worse to insult Muhammad than to insult Allah, you know. He's held in very high esteem. He experienced a lot of rejection. I'll be speaking more about the implications of that psychological damage later. Some aspects of Muhammad's life are positive. He cared for orphans. He had compassion for the poor. And sometimes you can see he spoke in a way that seemed fair or gentle. But some of the things that Muhammad said and did are in conflict with contemporary ethical standards. Some things that Muhammad did are absolutely shocking, hair-raisingly scary things. If Muhammad was doing those things here in Canada today, he would be convicted to life in prison many times over for the things he did. And this creates a real great problem, because if Muhammad is the best example and you're meant to follow him to be rightly guided, how can you get away from those shocking aspects of his life? From the rape of women, the torture of captives, from plundering and looting, from killing, telling lies, and many other issues. How can you get around and avoid those problems? Who's going to reform Muhammad, as Wafa Sultan said, in response to the question of, can't Islam be reformed? It's very interesting that Islamic law forbids criticism of Muhammad, and Sharia textbooks sometimes have long lists of the many ways in which you're not allowed to criticize Muhammad. That's because there's a great sensitivity about him, and I think some Muslims are embarrassed about Muhammad, and it's almost shameful. And I think the kind of eulogizing of Muhammad and emphasizing what an amazing man he is, in some ways becomes an overcompensation for the serious problems in his character. And what's really interesting is sometimes Western scholars, like Karen Armstrong and others, who have written about Muhammad, seem to censor all the materials and only focus on the good bits, because his life is so confrontational in its kind of raw character that you have to, in a way, do something about that. Either you talk about the things he actually did, in which case it becomes an apologetic act almost criticizing Islam, that is, unless you believe they're the right things to do, or you silence that material and you hide it, in which case you're kind of giving a different kind of apology for Islam, a positive apology. So it's very, very difficult to know how to manage this material. I think it's difficult for scholars who specialize in this area, because if they actually bring this material to light, it risks alienating Muslims and bringing issues of conflict. To talk about what Muhammad did and said in public today in Canada could incite hatred and contempt for Muslims. The fact that he married a girl when she was 9 and consummated the marriage married her when she was 6 and consummated the marriage when she was 8 or 9, and many, many Muslim women are married at a very young age because of that. That's a highly charged political issue. It's not just a religious issue. Now, the Shahada, that is, I confess that there's only one God and Muhammad is his prophet, binds a Muslim to the spiritual values and character of Muhammad. It's a bit like a chain of transmission of spiritual values. So his problems become your problems if you say that he is your guide. His sins become, in a way, your sins, and his oppressions become your oppressions. When you leave Islam, this is a very significant issue, the example of Muhammad. The Shahada is also a transgenerational covenant. The children of a Muslim are considered to be Muslims. So it's a binding of yourself and your generations to the Prophet of Islam. Breaking with Islam, breaking the Shahada, also, according to the Quran and teachings of Islam, involves a whole lot of curses and threats of punishment. As Surah 59:7 said, Allah is stern in reprisal. And Islam is the only religion in the world which mandates death for those that leave Islam. I'd like to speak about the organisation of the Quran. It's organised into chapters known as surahs. They're organised from the longest to the shortest, Paul's letters in the New Testament are from the longest to the shortest as well, actually. Romans is the longest. And it's not chronological in sequence. There's no storyline in the Quran, and it's quite a confusing book to read if you don't understand that. And even an individual chapter or surah can be made up of many passages from different times in Muhammad's life. It's a very personal document, the Quran. It's tied into events in the life of Muhammad, and it's revealed progressively throughout Muhammad's life. So he'd be in the middle of doing something and then he'd say, Allah has revealed this. And the meaning of that passage would be tied to whatever he was doing at that particular time and place. Muhammad and the Quran are one, they're inseparable. Muhammad is like the backbone, the Quran is like the backbone of Islam, and Muhammad is like the body of Islam. They together form a single working part. You can't just have a backbone or just have a body. The verses are sent down in specific contexts. The Quran doesn't usually give the context, so that's where you need the hadiths and the sirah to explain the context of the Quran. Putting the Quran in context means knowing the life of Muhammad, and they work together in that way. The hadiths often explain the Quran. Here's an example. There's a verse in the Quran, chapter 60, verse 8, that says, Allah forbids you not, with regard to those who fought not against you because of religion, and drove you not out of your homes, that you should show them kindness and deal justly with them. Now, it's a little bit hard to understand what that means, and that's typical of many passages in the Quran. But there's a hadith that embeds this text into a tradition. And Asmat bin Abu Bakr said, my mother came to me hoping for my favour. She was not a Muslim. So this Muslim woman, her mother came asking for help. So she asked Muhammad, can I be kind to my mother? And Muhammad said, yes. And then it's reported that Allah revealed at that point to Muhammad this verse. So when you interpret 68, you have to interpret it first of all as an instruction about whether to be kind to your relatives or friends who aren't Muslims once you've become a Muslim. And the instruction is, as long as they don't hassle you, drive you out of your homes, give you a hard time, you're allowed to be kind to them. You're allowed to be kind to your mum as long as she's not opposed to your religion and gives you a hard time because of it. Another thing that's important is that Allah, according to the Quran, can substitute one revelation for another, sending a better one. So Surah 2, 106 says, such of our revelations as we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring in place a better one or the like thereof. Don't you know that Allah can do all things? So the time sequence in the Quran is quite important, and when the Quran contradicts itself or says two different things, the later verse has authority over the earlier verse. The teachings about fighting is a classic example. The earlier verses of the Quran advise peaceful witness in Mecca, and then defensive fighting in Medina, and then attacking non-Muslims within limits, and finally unlimited warfare. And at each point, the revelation of increasing violence has authority over or abrogates the earlier verses. So here's a commentary on Forgive and Overlook, which is a verse in chapter 2 of the Quran. And Ibn Kathir, a very well-known commentator, says that was abrogated by the verse Kill the idolaters, 9:5, and Fight the people of the book, 9:29. Allah's pardon for the disbelievers was repealed, it was abrogated. It was abrogated by the verse of the sword, 9:5. The messenger of Allah, Muhammad, and his companions used to forgive the disbelievers and the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, just as Allah commanded, until Allah allowed fighting them. And in Arabic, the word fight means to kill. Then Allah destroyed those who he decreed to be killed. So that's an interpretation of the Quran that applies the principle of abrogation. That's the end of that section.